They tell you that blood is thicker than water, but they never mention how easily blood can be thinned by greed. I am sitting in a psychiatric observation room, the kind with white walls and humming lights that make your skin feel like it's vibrating. Through the double-paned glass, I watch the girl I raised, the girl who used to fall asleep against my shoulder while I restored 18th century manuscripts, wipe away a tear that isn't quite real. Clara leans toward the doctor, clutching a singed copper kettle like it's a piece of holy evidence. He doesn't even remember the stove was on, doctor. She whispers, her voice cracking with practiced perfection. I'm just so terrified he's finally going to hurt himself. I look down at the intake form on the table. My restorer's eye, trained to spot forged ink in ancient texts, sees the truth immediately. The smudge on my alleged signature isn't from a shaky, senile hand. It's a tremor of hesitation, the signature of a liar. My niece isn't trying to save me, she's trying to erase me. Before I tell you how I planned my escape from this institutional trap, if you find this story compelling, please like and subscribe. It truly helps me share these personal family experiences. Now, let me take you back to the day the ink first began to blur. My world has always been defined by the scent of beeswax, bitter tannins, and the dry, vanilla musk of aging parchment. I am a restorer of rare books, a man who spends weeks with a surgical scalpel and a magnifying loupe, lifting the stains of time from pages that should have crumbled a century ago. It is a profession of patience. You learn that a single drop of the wrong chemical can dissolve a legacy, just as a single lie can dissolve a family. For 23 years, I lived for the record. I never married, never sought the spotlight. When my brother Thomas died in that rain-slicked wreck, he left behind a 4-year-old girl with gold-flecked eyes and a mountain of gambling debt. I sold my thriving restoration shop in the city, packed my tools, and moved into the drafty Penhaligon estate to ensure Clara grew up with the dignity of our name. I thought I was preserving the family's future. I didn't realize I was merely funding my own replacement. You're a saint, Arthur, my friend Elias Thorne used to say. He's a lawyer who sees the world as a series of liability clauses. We were sitting in my workshop, the light of a dying Tuesday filtering through the dust motes. But saints usually end up on a stake. You're raising a shark in a goldfish pond. Look at the way she demands things. It's not a request, Arthur, it's an invoice. I laughed him off back then. She's a child, Elias. She's lost her parents. She needs to feel like the world won't let her down. The world won't let her down because you're holding it up on your back, he replied, tapping his cane against a stack of my ledgers. One day your back will break, and she'll step right over you to see what else is in the attic. Clara was 24 when the shifts began, subtle at first, like the slow yellowing of a poorly stored map. She had become a PR consultant, a weaver of narratives. She was brilliant at it. She could take a corporate disaster and turn it into a story of growth and resilience. I was so proud of her. I remember the day she brought home her first major bonus. We celebrated with a vintage Bordeaux in the library. I'm going to take care of you, Uncle Artie, she said, swirling the dark red wine. You've spent your whole life looking backward at old books. It's time someone looked forward for you. I like looking backward, Clara, I told her, smiling. The past is stable. It doesn't change its mind. But it can be edited, she whispered, and for a second, her face looked as sharp as my vellum scraper. The dits started 6 months ago. Small things. I'd find the stove burner clicking unlit. I'd lose my car keys only to find them in the refrigerator. Clara would sigh, her hand resting gently on my forearm. It's okay, Uncle. It happens to everyone at your age. Why don't you let me handle the mail? You seem so overwhelmed lately. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was an archivist. I knew exactly where I placed my keys. But when the person you love like your own flesh tells you that your mind is fraying, you start to check the mirror for a stranger. You start to doubt the very record you've spent your life protecting. Did I leave the gate open? I asked her one evening after she claimed the neighbor's dog had gotten in. You did, honey, she said, her voice dripping with that terrifying, patient kindness. But don't worry, I'm here to keep the records straight now. That was the night I noticed my day book, my meticulous log of every hour, had been moved 3 inches to the left. Someone had been reading my life, looking for the gaps where they could insert a new, darker story. The realization didn't arrive with a scream. It came with the quiet rustle of paper. I was looking for a misplaced roll of acid, free tape in Clara's old bedroom, the one she still uses when she stays over to keep an eye on me. Tucked deep inside a hollowed-out copy of a vintage fashion magazine, I found a heavy cream envelope. It was a final notice of foreclosure for the Penhaligon estate. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, like the atmosphere at a high altitude. My heart hammered a jagged rhythm against my ribs, that familiar, tightening grip of angina. I smoothed the document on the desk. The bank claimed I had defaulted on a $300,000 equity loan, a loan I never requested, a loan I never saw. I flipped to the signature page. There it was, Arthur J. Penhaligon. To anyone else, it was my hand, the elegant, slightly elongated P, the precise cross on it. But I am a man who has spent 30 years identifying the minute differences between an original and a counterfeit. I took my magnifying loupe from my pocket, my hand trembling as I pressed the glass against the ink. Tremor of hesitation. I whispered to the empty room. The ink didn't flow with the confident, continuous stroke of a man signing his own name. There were microscopic pauses at the curves, the telltale signs of a person tracing a pattern they didn't naturally own. It was a beautiful forgery, but it was a forgery nonetheless. Clara had sold the roof over my head to fund the life she paraded on social media. I waited for her in the library that evening. The shadows of the oak trees outside stretched across the floor like skeletal fingers. When she walked in, smelling of expensive perfume and rain, she didn't even notice the envelope sitting on the low table between us. Uncle Artie, why are you sitting in the dark? She asked, flicking the light switch. You'll strain your eyes. I found this, Clara, I said, my voice sounding like gravel being crushed. I slid the foreclosure notice toward her. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She didn't even look surprised. She merely picked up the paper, glanced at it, and set it back down with a wary, performative sigh. Oh, Arthur, we talked about this. Don't you remember? We never talked about a loan. I snapped, the anger finally breaking through the ice of my shock. I have never borrowed a cent against this house. This is my father's house. It was supposed to be your house. Clara walked over and knelt beside my chair, placing her cool, soft hands over mine. She looked up at me, and for a split second, I saw her scanning my face, not for pain, but for the efficacy of her own lie. Sweetie, this is exactly what the doctor was talking about. You were so stressed about my business expansion. You insisted on helping. You said the house was just sitting here, a dead capital, you called it. I never used those words, I said, pulling my hands away. I am an archivist, Clara. I don't speak in corporate jargon. And I didn't sign this. She looked at me then with a gaze so full of pity it made me want to retch. You did. In this very room. You were having one of your good days, or so I thought. But lately, the forgetting is getting worse, isn't it? You're losing the thread, uncle. You're becoming a danger to your own legacy. I know my own hand, Clara. That signature is a lie, is it? She stood up, her empathy vanishing, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. She checked the room, her eyes flickering toward the hallway, to ensure we were truly alone before dropping the mask. Because to the bank, and to the authorities, it's the only truth that matters. If you try to fight this, I'll have to tell them about the burnt kettles. I'll have to tell them how you've been wandering into the street at night, confused about what year it is. You wouldn't, I breathed. I've already started the paperwork. Arthur, she said, her voice dropping to a low, soothing hum that felt like a sedative. Not to hurt you, but to protect you. You've lived your life. You've done your part. Now, let me handle the messy reality of the present. Go to bed. You look tired. You look old. She turned and walked out, leaving me in a room that no longer belonged to me. I sat there for hours, the silence of the house pressing in. She had planned this with the same precision I used to restore a crumbling spine. She had seeded the doubt, planted the evidence, and now she was ready to harvest the estate. I stood up and walked to my workshop. I opened my day book, the one she thought was a symptom of my decline. I turned to the date on that loan document, March 14th, 1:15 a.m.'s applied gold leaf to the spine of the I need for the Thorn collection. 1:12:30 p.m. say. Lunch with Elias at the Gilded Lily. 20:00 p.m. Zane returned to shop. Clara called at 30:10 p.m. from her office in the city. She hadn't even been in the house that day. She had forged it in her office and slipped it into the pile of mundane papers she'd been helping me sign for months. My hobby wasn't a sign of madness. It was my black box. It was the only record of the truth left in a world she was rewriting. You want to edit the past, Clara? I whispered, picking up my vellum scraper. Fine. But I'm the one who knows how to remove the ink without tearing the page. To catch a weaver of narratives, you must become the silence between her sentences. I spent the next week playing the part of the fading patriarch. I shuffled my feet. I stared blankly at walls when she entered the room, and I allowed her to lead me by the elbow, as if I were a ghost inhabiting a body that had forgotten its purpose. But at night, when the house settled into its creaking midnight bones, I descended into the digital basement of our shared lives. Clara always mocked my antiquated ways, assuming that because I worked with parchment I was blind to the cloud. She was wrong. I had set up our family backup server 10 years ago, and I had never relinquished the administrator credentials. In the quiet hours of 20 Hazard AM, I sat in the blue glow of my monitor, digging through the deleted items folder of her since devices. The digital trash can where people bury the things they are too arrogant to realize never truly vanish. I found the first ghost at 30:15 a.m., a high-resolution scan of a life insurance policy issued by Global Heritage. It was my brother Thomas's policy. I felt a cold sweat prickle my hairline as I read the payout figure $1.2 million. I don't believe it, I whispered, my breath fogging the screen. When Thomas died, Clara told me there was barely enough for the funeral. I had spent my life savings, every penny from the sale of my shop, to keep her in private schools, believing we were surviving on the edge of ruin. But the payout had gone to a trust in her name, managed by a legal representative, whose signature looked suspiciously like a variation of the one she had used to steal my house. She had been a millionaire at 20, one while I was Skip, breathing to pay her Ivy League tuition. But that was just the prologue. As I dug deeper, the narrative turned from greed to something far more dangerous. I found spreadsheets for a shell company named AJP, Heritage Consulting, my initials, my social security number. The company was a sieve, a vehicle she had used to funnel consulting fees from her high-profile PR clients, money that was clearly being kicked back to avoid tax scrutiny. The audit notice arrived in a PDF attachment from 3 weeks ago. The IRS was flagging AJP, Heritage, for suspicious activity. Clara wasn't just stealing my home to pay her debts, she was setting me up to be the face of a financial crime. If the feds came knocking, they wouldn't find a polished PR consultant with a bright future. They would find a confused, old man with a basement full of ledgers and a signature on every illegal document. She was using my supposed mental decline as a pre-built legal defense for herself. She's not just taking the house. I realized, the horror of it settling into my marrow. She's handing me a prison cell. I needed a witness who wasn't blinded by her performative tears. I called Elias. We met in the back corner of a dusty botanical garden, where the air smelled of damp earth and rot. I laid out the printed emails and the insurance scans on a stone bench. Elias adjusted his spectacles, his face hardening into a mask of professional fury. Arthur, it's sociopathic. She's been running a laundering scheme through your identity for 18 months. The scale of this forgery is enough to put her away for 20 years. I don't want her in a cell, Elias, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. If I send her to prison, she becomes the martyr, the family victim of a senile uncle's paranoia. I want something more permanent than iron bars. What could be more permanent than prison? The truth, I replied. I want to force her to incinerate her own mask. I want her to have to choose between her freedom and the lie she's told the world about who she is. Elias looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, he looked afraid of me. You have that archivist look in your eye, Arthur. The one you get when you're about to scrape a fake masterpiece down to the raw canvas. She thinks I'm a blank page, I said. She forgot that I'm the one who taught her how to write. I returned to the house and began the final phase of my investigation. I needed the receipts. I opened my day book and began a cross-referenced index. For every day she claimed I was confused, I found a corresponding record of my reality. August 12th, Clara claims I left the stove on and wandered into the garden in my pajamas. My record August 12th, 8:00 p.m. Dinner with Elias at the Blue Heron. Receipt Fen 492. Dashcam footage from my car shows me arriving home at 1:15 p.m. Perfectly lucid. October 3rd, Clara claims I lost $10,000 in a telemarketing scam. My record. October 3rd, Clara asked for a loan for her firm's branding. I wrote the check, but she logged it as a loss of mental faculty in her private notes to the doctor. Every lie she told was a thread in a tapestry. I began to pull them one by one, not to destroy the fabric, but to see the pattern of the trap she had built. I discovered she had been slipping a mild sedative into my evening chamomile tea, a benzodiazepine she'd obtained through a private prescription. It was enough to make me groggy, enough to make my speech slur when the doctor came by for his wellness checks. I stood in the kitchen that night, watching her brew the tea. She looked so beautiful, so concerned, the steam rising around her face like a halo. "Here you go, Uncle Artie," she said, her voice a soft caress. "Drink up. It'll help the fuzziness go away." "Thank you, Clara," I said, taking the cup. "You really do think of everything, don't you?" "I have to," she whispered, kissing my forehead. "Since you can't." I waited until she turned her back to rinse a spoon. Then I poured the tea into the soil of a potted fern. I sat there, pretending to yawn, pretending to slip into the fuzziness she had bought for me. Beneath the table, my hand was gripped tight around my vellum scraper. I wasn't losing my mind. I was finding my edge. The investigation was over. The record was complete. Now, it was time for the exhibition. I had spent my life restoring books that were falling apart. Now, I was going to watch a person do the same. Revenge, in my profession, is not a sudden strike, it is the slow application of heat to loosen a fraudulent binding. I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the ghosts of better men's thoughts, and laid out the blueprint for Clara's undoing. I had enough evidence to call the police, but the law is a blunt instrument. It would offer her a plea deal, a chance to spin a new story about a troubled childhood and a confused uncle. No, she didn't deserve a courtroom yet. She deserved a mirror. I called Elias back to the house under the guise of state planning. We sat in the library, the very room where she had tried to gaslight me into insanity. I showed him my plan, the living ledger. "You're going to host a gala?" Elias asked, staring at my sketches. "Arthur, you're supposed to be hiding, not throwing a party for the very people she's defrauding." "It's not just a party, Elias. It's a curated exhibition of the Penhaligon legacy. I've already spoken to Detective Miller. I told her I'm doing a public reconstruction of the family archives using UV fluorescent forensic techniques. She's coming as a security consultant, but she'll be there to watch the ink tell the truth." "And by integrity, you mean her forgeries?" Elias said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Exactly. I've spent weeks using my scanners and UV lamps. I've created high-resolution, backlit displays of every check she forged, every shell company document she signed in my name. To the casual observer, it will look like a tribute to my career as an archivist. To Clara, it will be a countdown. She'll stop you the moment she sees the first frame," Elias warned. "She won't," I countered, "because I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks praising her. I'm going to tell every guest that Clara is the sole guardian of my mind and my money. I'm going to put her on a pedestal so high that if she tries to pull the plug, she'll be the only one holding the wire when it sparks." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens I had maintained for her sake. I want her to feel the weight of every lie she's told. I want her to have to stand in a room full of the people she admires and watch her own reflection shatter. It's a dangerous game, Arthur. What if she realizes you've stopped taking the sedatives? She's too arrogant for that, I said, my voice hardening. She sees what she expects to see, a broken man waiting for the end. She doesn't realize the end she's seeing isn't mine, it's hers. I picked up a photograph from the mantel. Clara at 10, holding a trophy from a debate match. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, a mourning for the girl she used to be, or perhaps the girl I merely imagined she was. I realized then that by destroying her mask, I was also destroying the only family I had left. The house would be mine again, but it would be empty. "Is it worth it?" Elias asked softly, as if reading my thoughts. I looked at the photograph one last time before turning it face down. "The record must be corrected, Elias. even if the truth leaves me with nothing but a blank page. I spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing the guest list. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a curator preparing for his final, most important exhibition. The trap was set. Now I just had to keep playing the fool until the lights went up. The 2 weeks leading up to the gala were a masterclass in controlled performance. I became the perfect, pliant victim. I shuffled through the house in my slippers, purposely misplacing my reading glasses and thanking Clara with tearful, shaky gratitude whenever she found them in places she had clearly hidden them herself. I watched her smile, that sharp, predatory glint behind a mask of filial devotion, as she whispered into her phone about finalizing the guardianship papers. To the outside world, I was a different man. I made dozens of phone calls when she was out, my voice steady and commanding. I spoke to her most prestigious clients, the titans of industry she worked so hard to impress. I'm hosting a small, private viewing of the Penhaligon archives, I told them. A celebration of the integrity that Clara has helped me preserve. It would mean the world to her if you were there to see the legacy she's protecting. By the time the night of the gala arrived, the estate was transformed. I had hired a professional catering crew, but I personally oversaw the lighting in the library and the main hall. I installed the backlit display frames I had built in my workshop. From a distance, they looked like beautiful, abstract studies of calligraphy and historical ink. Up close, they were something else entirely. Clara arrived home an hour before the guests, looking radiant in a dress that cost more than my first car. She stopped dead in the foyer, her eyes darting across the dozens of glowing frames. "Uncle Artie, what is all this?" she asked, her voice tight with a sudden, flickering suspicion. "I thought you said it was just a small dinner with Elias." "It's a surprise, dear," I said, leaning heavily on my cane and offering her a vacant, watery smile. "I wanted to show everyone how much you've done. Look at this one here, it's the Heritage series. I've restored the documents of our recent successes." She walked over to the nearest frame. It was a high-resolution, 3-foot, tall blow-up of the Shell Company's articles of incorporation. Under the UV-filtered light, the signature, my name, written in her hand, glowed with a haunting, artificial vibrance. "Arthur," she whispered, her face going ashen. This is private business. You can't show this to people." "Why not, Clara? It's a record of our partnership," I said, my voice dropping the senile quaver for just a second. "Isn't this what you wanted? For the world to see how you've taken charge?" The doorbell rang before she could respond. The first guests arrived at the CEO of a major tech firm and his wife, followed closely by Detective Sarah Miller, who arrived with Elias. "Clara! You look stunning," the CEO boomed, shaking her hand. "Your uncle told us all about the work you've been doing. He says this exhibit is a testament to the Penhaligon name." Clara was trapped. To take the displays down now would be to admit they were shameful. To leave them up was to walk through a minefield of her own making. She had to stand there, a fixed, frozen smile on her face, as I led the guests from frame to frame. "And here," I said, pausing before a particularly large display, "is a study in modern forgery detection. You see the way the ink pools at the bottom of the P. That's the sign of a hand that is trying too hard to be someone else." I felt Clara's fingers dig into my arm, her nails drawing blood through my suit jacket. "Uncle, I think you're getting tired," she hissed under her breath, her eyes darting to the detective. "Maybe you should go upstairs and rest." "I feel more awake than I have in months, Clara," I replied, loud enough for Miller to turn her head. "I was just telling Elias that my restoration work is finally complete. I've uncovered everything that was hidden under the surface." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of champagne flutes. I saw Detective Miller's eyes move from the display to Clara's white, knuckled grip on my arm. The narrative was shifting. The guests were no longer looking at a beautiful exhibition. They were looking at a crime scene. "Clara, dear," I said, patting her hand gently, "why don't we take our most important guests into the library? I have one final piece to show them. The living ledger. It's the most honest thing I've ever written." She looked at the exit, then at the room full of people who held her career in their hands. She had nowhere to run. She followed me into the library, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down the seconds of her old life. The library was thick with the scent of old leather and the impending ozone of a storm. I stood by my mahogany desk, the very place where Clara had placed the forged loan documents. Elias stood by the door, and Detective Miller lingered near the bookshelves, her arms crossed, her eyes tracking every muscle in Clara's twitching face. The centerpiece of tonight, I began, my voice clear and resonant, stripped of every false tremor, is a study in reconstruction. In my work, when a page is defaced, we don't just cover it up. We find the original intent. I pressed a remote. The digital screen above the fireplace flickered to life. It didn't show an ancient book. It showed a side-by-side comparison of the $1.2 million insurance payout and the pauper's funeral invoice she had shown me years ago. Then it shifted to the shell company's audit trail, with red lines connecting her IP address to the Arthur Penhaligon signatures. "Uncle, stop this," Clara said, her voice a low, desperate snarl. She stepped toward the screen, but Elias moved to block her path. "You're having an episode. Everyone, I'm so sorry, he's been hallucinating these records for weeks. The medication. The medication I've been pouring into the ferns, Clara." I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave. "You should see the ones in the library. They're dying, just as I was supposed to. Only I stopped drinking your tea 4 days ago. The fuzziness is gone. I can see everything now. I see the shell company. I see the 1.2 million. And I see exactly how you plan to make me the fall guy for the IRS. You recorded me." She breathed, her face draining of color until she looked like the parchment I spent my life cleaning. "I didn't have to," I replied. "You did it for me. You left your login active on the workshop computer. You were so sure I was a relic that you didn't think I could read your trash folder. You even kept a digital diary of the dosages you were putting in my tea. You were so meticulous, Clara. It's the one thing you actually learned from me." Detective Miller stepped forward, her voice professional and chillingly neutral. "Ms. Penhaligon, I'd like to see those estate planning papers you mentioned earlier, the ones your uncle supposedly signed while confused. I think we need to discuss the forensic discrepancies in those signatures." Clara's mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She lunged at me not with the grace of a consultant, but with the raw, ugly fury of a cornered animal. "I did it for us! I did it to keep this house! You were just going to let it rot while you played with your stupid paper? You owe me this life! You owe me everything!" "I gave you everything," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "I gave you 23 years of my life. I gave you the business I loved. I gave you a father's devotion. But you didn't want a father, Clara. You wanted a benefactor you could liquidate. You wanted a legacy without the burden of the man who built it." She looked around the room, at the CEO who was already backing toward the exit, at the detective reaching for her radio, and at Elias who was holding a legal document. "Here is the choice, Clara," I said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a full confession of the insurance fraud and a voluntary transfer of all stolen assets back to the estate. "Sign this. Relinquish the house, the trust, and the shell company. If you do, I won't press charges for the elder abuse or the poisoning. You'll walk out of here with nothing but your name, which you've already dragged through the dirt. And if I don't—" She spat, her eyes darting toward the door. "Then Detective Miller has enough in those frames outside to hold you for the IRS audit alone," Elias added. "The paper trail is a mile long, Clara, and your uncle is the best tracker in the business. You aren't walking out of here. You're being carried out in cuffs." She grabbed the pen, her hand shaking so violently the ink splattered across the desk, a mess I would have to clean up later. She signed it with a jagged, ugly scrawl that finally looked like her own hand. No more hesitation, no more tracing, just the raw mark of her defeat. She threw the pen at me. "I hope you enjoy this tomb, Arthur. I hope you enjoy being alone with your dead books. Because that's all you are, a dead man in a dead house. You're as dry as the paper you worship." "I may be alone," I said, watching her go, "but for the first time in years, the record is finally accurate. And unlike your narrative, Clara, the truth doesn't require a sedative to be swallowed." As she was escorted out by the detective, not in handcuffs yet, but under the heavy shadow of a looming investigation, the library fell into a terrifying, absolute silence. The guests had fled. The gala was over. I looked down at the confession. It was a perfect document, legally binding, factually correct. I sat in my chair and felt the full weight of my victory. It felt like a mountain of lead. I had saved the Penhaligon name by destroying the only Penhaligon I loved. The justice was absolute, and the cost was total. I looked at the living ledger, still glowing on the screen, and realized that while the truth can set you free, it can also leave you with nowhere to go. The house is quiet now, not the peaceful, restorative silence of a library, but the heavy, airless quiet of a mausoleum. In the weeks since the gala, the Penhaligon estate has been returned to my name. The shell company is dismantled, and the banks have withdrawn their foreclosure notices. On paper, I am a whole man again. I have my home, my workshop, and my dignity. Yet, as I walk through the hallways, I find myself pausing at the door of Clara's old room, listening for a ghost that refuses to haunt me. Justice, I've discovered, is a cold comfort. It doesn't fill the chair across from you at dinner. It doesn't undo the 23 years I spent believing I was building a future for someone who was merely counting down the days until my demise. I spent my life thinking I was a restorer, capable of fixing any damage. But you cannot restore a person like you restore a book. You can't use a solvent to remove the rot of the soul without destroying the paper itself. Elias came over last night. He brought a bottle of expensive scotch and sat in the library, his eyes avoiding the spot on the desk where Clara signed her confession. The firm she worked for dropped her, Arthur, Elias said, staring into his glass. The news of the exhibition traveled fast. She's moved to the city, working some entry-level job under a different name. She's alive, but the Clara Penhaligon she spent 10 years inventing is dead. I know, I replied. I saw her name in the legal filings yesterday. It looked so strange. Just ink on a page. Do you regret it? He asked, his voice low. I looked at the bookshelves, at the thousands of lives recorded in leather and vellum. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the only way to save the family was to cut out its heart. But Elias is a cancer. If I had let her finish her story, there would be nothing left of us but a footnote of fraud. You did the right thing, Arthur, even if it feels like the wrong one. He left shortly after, leaving me alone with the records. I walked to my workshop and picked up my vellum scraper. I sat at my bench and opened my day book to the final page of this chapter. My hand was steady, no tremor of hesitation, no fear of the future. I wrote the truth of the evening gala concluded. Estate secured. The record is corrected. I realized then that my legacy isn't the house or the money. It's the truth I fought to preserve. Clara wanted a narrative of decline, but I gave the world a chronicle of resilience. I am the last Penhaligon, and though the line ends with me, it ends with the ink still clear and the pages untainted. I have spent my life guarding the past, but tonight I am closing the book on my niece. I am moving my tools back into the light. The silence in this house is no longer a burden. It is a clean, white page waiting for a new entry. If this story touched you, or made you think about the value of truth in a world of lies, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. It helps me continue sharing these real experiences. Thanks for listening to my story.